Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are strapping on the dive gear and descending into the cold, silent world of the seabed. We're going to be exploring the planet's most fascinating and, I think, most fragile archives, shipwrecks.
They really are unique time capsules, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, these sites aren't just, collections of sunken gold or forgotten artifacts. They're these integrated cross-sections of global history. You've got revolutionary engineering, military history, complex trade networks, all spanning millennia, just sitting there.
That's so right. And our source material for this deep dive takes this monumental sweep. We're combining the ancient and the hypermodern. We're looking at some highly technical structural analysis.
Yeah, computational modeling.
Exactly. Linear static finite element analysis, or FEA, applied to these ancient hulls. And we're setting that right alongside these astounding archaeological reports, detailing Bronze Age cargo that took tens of thousands of dives to recover.
And then we're plunging into the legal side. The incredibly complex, often billion-dollar legal battles over who actually owns the treasures of the deep.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. Our mission today is, well, it's truly interdisciplinary. We need to get our heads around not just what was on these ships, but how the ships themselves were engineered. We're going to trace this major technological shift that just fundamentally changed naval architecture.
And then the big question.
And then the big questions, the profound ethical and legal questions that come up the moment a historically significant and often immensely valuable wreck is found.
So we've got this blend of modern science looking at the deep past. We have FEA results comparing wrecks like the Malagan Michael and the Door 2011.
We have these detailed accounts of massive hulls, like the Ulu Baril.
And then a deep dive into foundational maritime legal guidelines. I mean, the U.S. Abandoned Shipwreck Act and these huge international court cases like the Nuestra Senora de las Mercedes and the ongoing saga of the San Jose.
So it's a really comprehensive look, at engineering triumphs, economic necessities, and these enduring human tragedies that span over 3,000 years.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with what I think is one of the most fundamental and honestly surprising technological revolutions in naval architecture. The great structural shift from shell-first building to frame-based construction.
Right. For centuries, shipbuilding in the Mediterranean was governed by instinct, by tradition. But roughly spanning the first millennium AD, we see this slow but really monumental shift away from the shell-first method.
For the frame-based method.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a quick change. It was an evolution that changed the whole way engineers approach structure.
So when you describe that as a shift from artisan instinct to planned engineering, what does that actually mean for the person building the ship, the shipwright?
It means moving from building the skin first to building the skeleton first.
Yeah.
So let's define the older method. Shell-first construction.
Yep.
The hull was built primarily by joining the strakes. Those are the long planks that form the outer skin edge to edge. They relied really heavily on these labor-intensive, precise connections. Things like pegged or unpegged mortise and tenon joints, dowels, cokes.
Or even sewing in some of the really early examples.
Even sewing, yeah. So the resulting hull, even before you added any internal ribs, was this singular, highly rigid structural component.
So all the integrity, all the strength, they came directly from that meticulous planking.
Precisely. The transverse frames, what we recognize as the ribs, they were only added after this rigid hull shell was fully formed. And crucially, these frames were often independent of the keel itself. They were mostly there to stabilize the shape and carry the cargo floor, not to provide the primary strength.
And a good example of that is the Malagan Michael shipwreck.
The Malagan Michael, yep, dates to 400 BC. It's one of the best representatives of this incredibly rigid shell-first technique.
And the frame-based method, the one that eventually took over and led to modern shipbuilding, that's just the complete opposite process.
It completely flips the methodology on its head. Frame-based construction starts with the skeleton. You have transverse frames fixed to the keel first, often using these massive timbers, forming a true skeletal rib cage.
So the shipwright is building the interior structure first.
They are, and that structure is then reinforced by longitudinal components, things like stringers. It's only then that the relatively thin hull planks are fastened to those pre-existing frames. The planks in this case are just the envelope, they're not the primary strength component.
And the Door 2011 shipwreck from the 6th century AD, that's our example of the later frame-based method in action.
That's the one. It really demonstrates that later technique.
So this is where we get to bring in the modern engineering analysis to sort of interrogate this ancient choice, we use linear static finite element analysis, or SEA, to digitally reconstruct these wrecks.
Right.
How does this computer modeling help us compare a 400 BC boat with a 6th century AD boat?
Well, FEA is the ultimate tool for stress testing structures that, don't exist anymore or can't be physically tested. We model the ancient designs like Mogg and Michael and Door 2011 using numerical reconstruction.
Okay.
And this lets us simulate all kinds of loads: still water pressure, cargo weight distribution, wave torsion, even wind forces. We look for metrics like rigidity and von Mises stress values, which tell us where structural failure is most likely to happen.
And when researchers first compared these two archetypes, they found something counterintuitive, right? Especially since the Door ship had about 40% greater displacement. It was built to carry heavier cargo, but it was a similar length and beam.
Precisely. The initial global FEA analysis suggested both ships had these high degrees of rigidity and surprisingly low stress values under typical still water conditions. It seemed to be, quote, on a structural par.
Which creates a paradox.
It does. If the older, more labor-intensive shell-first method was already performing so well, why did shipwrights move away from it? The shift didn't seem mechanically necessary, at least not based on just typical sailing conditions.
This is a really crucial point, and it's why the engineers had to go beyond that first analysis. They had to move from a global assessment to a controlled one to really get the structural implications.
That's exactly right. They realized the global analysis was just too broad. They needed to isolate the variables. So researchers then did these further controlled analyses using symmetrically identical archetypal quarter hulls. That way they could remove the noise of slightly different dimensions.
And they just varied the load, simulating worst-case scenarios.
They did. Severe wave torsion, uneven cargo distribution, concentrated forces. They threw everything at it.
And what did that controlled test reveal about the underlying strength of the two techniques?
In every single controlled test scenario, the shell-first samples consistently and significantly showed higher rigidity. And it wasn't just that they were more rigid. They showed less extreme differences in stress distribution across the hull compared to the frame-based samples.
So what does that mean in practical terms?
It means the shell-first hull was intrinsically stronger. It was just better at distributing severe, uneven loads.
That is a major insight. It completely challenges this idea of, linear technological progress. The older, more labor-intensive method was actually structurally superior in terms of sheer integrity and rigidity.
It forces us to ask that why question again. If the shell-first design offered greater inherent structural capability, why did frame-based construction take over and eventually dominate naval architecture globally?
And the answer probably isn't in physics, but in economics. You mentioned the intricacy of those mortise and tenon joints.
Exactly. The strength of the shell-first method came directly from the thousands of precise, hand-carved, edge-jointed planks. Researchers even used a more advanced nonlinear FEA on solid wood elements, simulating pine and oak, just to analyze the strength of these connection points.
Compared to just a single solid piece of wood.
Right. And the simulation confirmed the resource strength. Comparing two typical joints from ancient wrecks, they found one reached 61% of the strength of a solid beam, and another reached 80%.
Which is pretty robust performance.
It is, but it represents an astronomical amount of time and skill. A shipwright had to accurately cut hundreds, maybe thousands, of identical joints to complete a hull. Moving to a frame-first model let them simplify the plank attachment dramatically. They could use simple fasteners, nails, or trunnels and attach them to a pre-built frame.
So the fascinating hypothesis here is that this whole structural shift was less about optimizing for maximum strength and more about optimizing for what? Manufacturability, speed, and cost.
It's a classic economic decision disguised as an engineering one. The inherent reduction in rigidity, which then demanded more internal framing, was accepted as a trade-off for a system that was faster to build and easier to scale.
So they traded this complex, highly rigid skin for a cheaper, faster skeleton.
And the required strength of that skeleton was then achieved by just adding sheer volume of framing timbers and metal fasteners. It was a different, more industrial form of labor and material.
Building on that, let's explore how ancient shipwrights actually translated their desired shape into a three-dimensional reality. I mean, this is before the era of paper blueprints. They needed a system that was repeatable.
And that's where geometry stepped in, long before formal naval architecture textbooks were ever written. The core of this replicable tradition in the Mediterranean was what's called the hull molding system. This approach used a single, tangible master reference, the master mold, or maître gabarit, to define the curvature of the main, warmest part of the hull.
That's a powerful concept, using one physical template to govern the entire body of the ship. So how did they apply this single template to make the ship taper harmoniously toward the bow and stern?
They used a system of proportional adjustment that relied on three key wooden instruments. First, you have the master mold itself.
Right.
Second, the rising square, or tablette d'accouplement, which helped control the height of the floor and the depth of the hull. And third, the wooden scale, or trebuchet, and that was the key instrument for controlling the narrowing.
So the method involved constantly moving and adjusting the master mold's shape as they moved along the keel.
Exactly. Starting from the widest point, the master frame, the shipwright, would move the master mold forward and backward. At each successive frame position, they would apply a predetermined amount of rising, making the floor higher, and narrowing, making the breadth shorter.
And the other tools kept it consistent.
The trebuchet and the tablette d'accouplement ensured these changes were consistent and proportional. The goal was to create this harmonious body defined by a geometric relationship, not just guesswork.
And this isn't just a theory from some old book. We have hard archaeological proof of this system being used centuries ago.
We do. The Culipsis 6 wreck, dated to the late 13th to early 14th century, provides the oldest known archaeological evidence of this precise, systematic design method. It was a pivotal find because the shipwright literally left behind their records etched into the ship's bones.
What kind of markings did they find on the floor timbers that confirmed they were using this maître gabarit system?
Well, the floor timbers were engraved with specific coded markings that were essential for assembly. They found a central surmark which indicated the alignment with the keel, and that stayed constant.
Okay.
But they also had lateral surmarks marks placed at the beginning of the bilge turn, and these marks varied in position systematically. This variation corresponds directly to the required narrowing of that specific floor timber as it moved away from the master frame.
So they were basically numbered pieces of a sophisticated geometrical puzzle.
They were. The timbers were even numbered using Roman numerals, up to 25, making sure they were installed in the correct, predetermined sequence between the master frame and the tail frames.
And researchers could then check this against historical models.
Yep. They checked the narrowing and rising recorded on these timbers against historical geometric models used in shipbuilding, and the most applicable model was the Venetian mezzaluna.
The half-moon.
Half-moon diagram, yeah. It was a graphical method used in later Venetian manuscripts to calculate those exact intermediate narrowing values. And the near-perfect agreement between the geometric curves from the mezzaluna diagram and the shapes on the Culipsis timbers. It just validates the whole interpretation.
So it shows that ancient builders possessed and applied these complex, repeatable geometric design methods, a technical culture that spanned the entire Mediterranean.
And you see this continuity reflected in the traditional Greek monochnaro system. It means one single mold. It relied on the same three basic components to maintain design control.
It's really a testament to how practical knowledge just diffused across cultures. These design aids were the precursors to modern blueprints. They allowed complex structures to be replicated and scaled efficiently based on a proven geometry.
Absolutely.
Now let's bring this back to the early adoption of the frame first method we talked about earlier. I'm thinking of the example of the Port Breteau II wreck. This ship gives us this incredible localized insight into shipbuilding around 600 AD in France.
Port Breteau II, yeah. It was a small 10-ton sailing merchant ship designed for coastal and inland navigation on the Charente River. It's a pivotal example of frame-first construction in this early transitional period. Its dimensions were based on fixed proportions. For instance, the breast was 1/2.9 of the length overall.
Wait, can you just quickly clarify that term for our audience? LOA?
Sure. LOA means length overall. It's the maximum length of the ship's hull measured from the very front of the bow to the very back of the stern. So this ratio breadth to LOA was a standard design constraint. But what's really insightful about Port Breteau II is the material science.
How so?
Dendrochronological analysis showed that the ship was built using only young oak, diameters between 10 and 30 centimeters, and all sourced from the same local open area.
So that suggests a highly localized supply chain.
And a resourceful shipwright, optimizing the use of readily available timber rather than importing massive, slow-growth, mature oak.
Even the fasteners were highly specific, showing an evolved craft.
Oh, indeed. They classified the iron nails by their head shape: triangular, square, rectangular, and round. The triangular-headed nails, for instance, were specifically used for joining the butts of the heavy whales. Those are the thick, reinforcing planks in the bow and stern.
So this isn't just randomly assembling materials, it's a sophisticated classification of material function.
It is.
And what does this small regional freighter carrying a 10-ton load of agricultural surplus or salt tell us about the socio-economic structure of 7th century France?
It speaks volumes about the early medieval economy. This ship wasn't built for, Mediterranean-wide commerce. It was built for localized logistical management. In this pre-merchant economy, the customer was likely a powerful regional entity, the church, or a major landowner, needing to transport bulk goods along the river efficiently.
So it gives us this tangible look at the powerful client base driving regional transportation at the local level.
Long before the great seafaring trading republics emerged.
Exactly.
Okay, the moment we transition from the engineering of the hull to the cargo within, the scope of this conversation just explodes. A shipwreck is literally a snapshot of a single moment of globalization, of culture, of power. Let's start with the spectacular monumental discovery that really defines Bronze Age trade, the Uluburun wreck.
Uluburun. Found off the coast of Turkey, it's one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, dating to approximately 1320 BC. And the difficulty of the site is part of its legend. It was found at depths between 44 and 61 meters, scattered down the steep, treacherous slope.
And the recovery effort was just insane. It was an astonishing 22,400 dives over 10 years.
So this wasn't just a trading vessel, this was essentially a state-sponsored diplomatic delivery. What did the sheer volume of strategic and luxury materials reveal about how interconnected the late Bronze Age was?
It showed an unprecedented level of connectivity. The core cargo was strategic. 10 tons of copper oxide ingots and nearly a ton of tin ingots.
Which, of course, is what you need to make bronze.
It's the recipe for bronze. It indicates a major supply chain operation, likely destined for the ancient.
You mentioned the copper ingots had to be stabilized immediately when they were recovered. They used a polymer called paraloid B72. Why was that necessary? What happens to materials like that when they come out of the deep?
It's a conservation nightmare. When these massive copper ingots lay on the seabed for millennia, they absorb salts and moisture. When you expose them to air, the absorbed water starts to evaporate. As the water leaves, crystallization starts, creating internal pressure that literally tears the artifact apart.
So paraloid B72 stops that.
It's an acrylic resin used to stabilize porous, salt-laden materials. The degraded metal had to be saturated with the polymer to prevent immediate catastrophic deterioration. It allows for study.
That attention to conservation just highlights the incredible value of the find, which went far beyond raw materials.
Oh, the luxury items spanned regions from Scandinavia to Africa. They found ebony logs, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, 150 ceramic vessels, ostrich shells, and most intriguingly, Baltic amber nuggets.
Baltic amber. So that implies a trade route reaching deep into Northern Europe.
It does. But the personal diplomatic touches are what really capture the imagination.
I can imagine.
Over 70,000 glass and final speeds. The raw glass ingots alone totaled over 175 pieces in blue, turquoise, purple, and yellow. These were clearly manufactured to imitate highly prized natural materials like lapis lazuli and turquoise. It suggests advanced manufacturing aimed at the luxury market.
And of course, the big one.
The gold scarab inscribed with the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. That single artifact just confirmed the diplomatic and royal nature of the shipment.
And the crew composition itself confirmed the multinational nature of the voyage.
Oh, it was a truly multicultural venture. The recovery of 4 balances and corresponding weights points to at least 4 Phoenicians or Canaanite merchants using the Syro-Palestinian weight system.
Right.
But the presence of Mycenaean seals, double axes, and sets of personal effects belonging to at least 2 individuals confirms that Mycenaeans were also on board, perhaps as escorts for the valuable diplomatic gifts.
Okay, let's move forward about 1,000 years. The Dor Lagoon in Israel gives us a snapshot of the Iron Age, a period that often gets characterized by less centralized sea power.
The Dor Lagoon clusters, yeah. They span 500 years from the 11th to 6th centuries BCE, and they're crucial because they tie maritime activity directly to the ancient port city of Dor, which was a major hub for centuries. These are among the few Iron Age cargoes we know of.
And what was in those 3 clusters that rewrote the history of Iron Age trade?
The cargoes included iron ingots and different styles of storage jars, specifically Phoenician-style jars and basket-handle amphorae. And the contents of these jars were incredibly rare: preserved resin and grape seeds.
Wow.
This confirms that sea trade remained robust, facilitating the exchange of specialty commodities even during periods of significant land-based political volatility.
So it emphasizes the continuous role of the ocean as the primary binder of distant coastlines, regardless of whether Egyptians, Phoenicians, or Babylonians controlled the land.
The sea was always faster, more reliable, and just more economically viable for bulk transport. That continues right through to the medieval period, as we see along the maritime Silk Road off China.
Right, the Huaguanjiao 1 wreck, sunk around 1162 during the Song dynasty. This shifts our perspective from royal gifts to industrial-scale production.
This ship, built in the Fujian style, was an engineering marvel for its time. It had a strong hull with up to 6 layers of pine planking for reinforcement against shipworms. And critically, it used advanced watertight bulkheads.
A technology that ensured if one section flooded, the ship could often remain afloat, centuries before Western navies adopted the concept.
Exactly. And its cargo reflects an economy geared for mass export. It wasn't elite luxury items, it was standardized, mass-produced ceramics intended for wide overseas consumption. Thousands of blue and white porcelain pieces, standardized bowls, plates, pots.
And they could date it precisely.
An inscribed white celadon bowl, marked made by Pansan Lang in Renwu year, definitively dated the ship's final voyage to 1162. This wreck perfectly illustrates Song Dynasty China's emergence as a global industrial power focused on trade.
But because of its depth in the South China Sea, human divers couldn't do the long-term excavation. What technology was required for that?
This was a task for the Deep Sea Warrior, a 20-ton bathyscaphe submersible. It allowed archaeologists to spend up to 10 hours underwater at the site, using sonar and high-resolution imaging to document everything.
But even with that tech,
Even with that, the site had already suffered severe, irreversible damage due to illegal looting, including the use of explosives and prying open the bulkheads to get to the cargo.
that's just a grim reminder of the urgency of protection. But before we dive into the legal battles, let's take a moment for some of the incredible, more personal, and often astonishing artifacts recovered from wrecks across history.
I love these stories. They bring history to life in such an immediate way. I mean, think about the simple act of drinking water. The French Navy corvette La Seine, sunk in 1846, carried this ingenious copper kitchen stove and water distiller.
So it made salt water drinkable.
It did. This piece of tech was essential. It allowed the crew to efficiently turn salt water into potable water, drastically extending the ship's range without needing frequent stops at ports to replenish.
That's a practical survival triumph. Then there's that incredible biological survival story from the Sydney Cove.
The Sydney Cove, a merchant vessel, sank off Tasmania in 1797. The cold, dark environment preserved the contents beautifully. When archaeologists retrieved sealed glass bottles from the wreck, they found beer with yeast that was still viable after 2 centuries.
No way.
Yes, scientists managed to isolate that extremely rare strain, and in a wonderful act of historical recreation, they used it to brew a new batch of beer.
That's amazing, a literal taste of 18th century maritime life. And what about technological precursors to modern devices?
The find from the Yenikapi ship 12, an 8th century Byzantine vessel, included what we might call the Byzantine iPad, 5 wooden tablets fitted together like a notebook.
What, with wax?
Exactly. The interior surfaces were coated with wax, allowing the user to jot notes, keep accounts, and then wipe the surface clean. It functioned just like a reusable notebook for daily logistics.
Then you have the wrecks that tell stories of natural forces just reshaping the environment. The steamer Arabia, a crucial vessel carrying supplies before the Civil War, snagged on a submerged tree in 1856 and sank into the Missouri River.
And then the river just shifted its course dramatically over the next century and a half. When the Arabia was rediscovered in 1987, it was lying half a mile inland, preserved under a farmer's cornfield. The excavation team had to dig down 45 feet through silt.
I can't even imagine that sight. Digging a perfectly preserved paddle wheel steamer out from under an Iowa farm.
It was a time capsule. Because it was sealed in oxygen-free mud, it yielded the largest collection of pre-Civil War artifacts in the U.S. Vast amounts of glass, tools, beads, even preserved foods. It's an unparalleled glimpse into the material culture of the American frontier.
Finally, we have the intensely personal and valuable artifacts, like the find from the Palmwood wreck off the Netherlands.
This 17th century wreck, still unidentified, contained a trove of textiles that just defied preservation norms. They found remarkably well-preserved, highly valuable silk dress and a luxurious velvet purse. The quality suggests the passenger was extremely wealthy, maybe nobility or even royalty.
And of course, the simple tragedy of Wallace Hartley's violin, found tied to his body after the Titanic sank in 1912. These artifacts, whether they're high value or deeply personal, they connect us directly to the individuals whose lives were caught up in these moments.
They do. And the moment an artifact comes to light, the questions shift from historical curiosity to this intense legal and ethical scrutiny. This is where the complexity of international law, conservation science, and the desire for commercial profit just collide.
First, we have to stress the absolute mandate of conservation. It's a race against time. The deep sea is this perfect, cold, dark, low oxygen archive, but once those artifacts are exposed to air and light, they rapidly degrade.
The fragility is immense, especially for organic materials like waterlogged wood, leather, or textiles. These artifacts are thoroughly saturated with water and corrosive salts. They have to remain wet and dark until specialized conservation can happen. If waterlogged wood, for example, is allowed to dry,
It just falls apart.
the surface tension from the evaporating water causes the weakened, water-swollen cell walls to collapse. The resulting structure shrinks dramatically, it distorts, and it effectively turns into dried, warped splinters. You're destroying millennia of history in a matter of hours.
And metals, particularly iron, they face a different kind of threat underwater, one that paradoxically creates a protective layer.
That's the phenomenon of concretion. When iron artifacts corrode, they form this hard, cement-like shell made of corrosion products, sand, and marine life around them. This shell often encapsulates and protects nearby non-iron artifacts.
But it has to come off eventually.
Right. While it's protective underwater, the concretion itself is corrosive and has to be carefully managed and removed in a lab setting before you can treat the artifacts underneath.
And climate change is adding a terrifying new variable to this conservation urgency.
Absolutely. The intensification of tropical storms, fueled by global warming, represents an existential threat to underwater cultural heritage, particularly wrecks in shallower, warmer waters. A single supercharged hurricane can easily scatter, bury, or completely obliterate an exposed site
A permanent loss of invaluable historical information.
before archaeologists can even begin documentation.
This inherent vulnerability is why the debate over ownership, especially when billions of dollars of treasure are involved, is so contentious. And the most fundamental legal concept here is sovereign immunity.
Sovereign immunity applies specifically to warships and non-commercial government vessels. It means that the vessel and everything on board is considered the property of the state whose flag it sailed under, and that state is immune from legal claims by other states or private salvors in perpetuity.
And the definitive modern case demonstrating this principle is the Spanish frigate Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes.
The Mercedes, yeah. A Spanish Navy frigate sunk in 1804. In 2007, an American salvage company discovered the wreck off Portugal and salvaged 500,000 gold and silver coins. Spain immediately asserted sovereign immunity.
Arguing that no matter how much time had passed, the warship and its contents belonged to the Spanish state.
Exactly. And after years of litigation, the U.S. court upheld Spain's claim.
It did. In 2012, a U.S. federal court ruled in Spain's favor based on the international law of sovereign immunity. They forced the salvage company to return the entire haul worth hundreds of millions of dollars back to Spain.
And the court cited evidence that confirmed the vessel was indeed naval and had sunk during military action. The ruling established a strong precedent. If it was a sovereign vessel, it remained sovereign property.
So, if the Mercedes was complicated, the case of the galleon San Jose is a nearly half-century-long legal quagmire, and it potentially involves the greatest treasure ever found.
The San Jose galleon, sunk in 1708 off the coast of Cartagena, Colombia, has an estimated net worth of over $20 billion. It's perhaps the holy grail of sunken treasure. And the site is entangled in this agonizing legal battle involving at least 3 primary claimants.
And they all have conflicting legal and historical grounds.
They do.
So walk us through the claimants and their specific arguments.
Okay, first you have Spain, which asserts the claim of sovereign immunity. Just like the Mercedes, the San Jose was a warship of the Spanish crown, and therefore, under international law, the treasure belongs to Spain in perpetuity.
Then you have Colombia,
Yeah.
where the ship was discovered in their territorial waters.
Right. Colombia asserts that the wreck constitutes national cultural heritage, and as such, should remain under Colombian jurisdiction and ownership. They argue the value isn't just in the gold, but in the history of the site itself. They've passed laws declaring it a national treasure.
And the third claimant brings in the issue of human rights and resource extraction, a deeply relevant claim.
That's the indigenous Bolivian Cora Nation. Their claim is perhaps the most provocative. They argue that the majority of the riches, the gold and silver being transported, were extracted from their ancestral lands during the Viceroyalty of Peru, often under horrific duress and forced labor.
So their legal argument is rooted in the concept that the treasure is stolen property.
Or at least unethically acquired property, and it should be returned to the descendants of those whose labor produced it.
And on top of all that, you still have the American Salvage Company that claims to have found the ship in the early 1980s, claiming 50% of the contents under traditional salvage law.
It is the perfect encapsulation of the conflict. Sovereignty versus jurisdiction versus cultural heritage versus property rights versus commercial salvage. And until those conflicting principles are reconciled, the wreck remains locked in legal purgatory.
That brings us to the core ethical framework for managing shipwrecks, established by the U.S. Shipwreck Management Guidelines under the Abandoned Shipwreck Act. These guidelines try to move the focus away from commercial gain.
The primary goal of these guidelines is to prioritize archaeological research, public appreciation, and understanding of maritime history. They emphasize that wrecks are non-renewable historical resources. And there are two particularly powerful learnings in these guidelines that inform global policy.
Let's start with Guideline 8, which addresses the issue of recovering intact ships.
Guideline 8 strongly discourages the recovery and display of intact shipwrecks. This seems counterintuitive, right? Because recovering an entire historic ship would be the ultimate historical display.
But the costs are prohibitive.
Prohibitively expensive. To properly raise, conserve, maintain, and perpetually exhibit an intact, waterlogged wooden ship requires massive, ongoing funding that few governments or museums can sustain.
So unless the wreck is in imminent danger of unavoidable destruction and sufficient perpetual funding is secured, the general rule is to leave it in place and focus on documentation.
Exactly. The cost of conservation is the true gatekeeper of history. And Guideline 6 addresses how private salvors interact with these finds, making sure the public interest is protected.
For private companies that are authorized to recover artifacts, how is the title transfer handled?
Guideline 6 is explicit. Title transfer to private parties, even for non-unique items, like common coins or pottery, happens only after the authorized recovery is complete, the items are properly conserved and analyzed, and the required final report is approved by the state.
And the state keeps that stuff.
The state should always retain title to unique, exceptionally valuable, or representative items. This structure ensures that the primary motivation for recovery remains historical documentation and public benefit, not simply immediate financial gain.
We've covered the engineering theory, the design methods, the legal fallout, but let's return to the most physically challenging moment in a ship's life, the launch. Before modern technology, this moment, transitioning this immense weight from land to water, was the ultimate engineering barrier.
It was a moment of immense strain and risk. I mean, before hydraulic dry docks or sophisticated slips, moving a large ship was this laborious process, relying on immense manpower and specialized temporary structures. The ship rested on what was often called a cradle, an immense structure of timber and blocks built around the keel.
And that would just slide down greased or tallowed groundways into the water.
It would. It sounds like an exercise in controlled physics and pure brute force.
I can imagine.
Accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries suggest that launching large warships or merchantmen could take many days. It required capstans, thick cables, and hundreds of men to incrementally drag the vessel down the ways until momentum and water buoyancy finally took over.
Initially, early naval practice favored launching the ship bow first. Why was that the standard approach for so long, despite the difficulty?
Launching bow first was thought to keep the keel more nearly parallel to the groundways throughout the entire slide. It minimized excessive vertical strain on the hull. It was also considered the most practicable way to haul a ship back ashore for major repairs, because the bow entry was geometrically simpler.
But over time, the preferred orientation shifted strategically to launching stern first. This seems counterintuitive. The bow is often pointier. It would seem to enter the water more gracefully. When and why did this engineering evolution happen?
This shift became standard in major shipbuilding nations like France and Portugal by the 18th century, and it was a strategic decision to mitigate structural damage caused by internal bending stresses. The key concept is buoyancy.
Okay, so explain the forces at play here, specifically hogging and sagging during a launch.
These are the two primary bending stresses a ship undergoes longitudinally. Sagging happens when the center of the ship is excessively supported by water buoyancy, while the bow and stern are less supported, causing the middle to dip.
And hogging is the opposite.
Conversely, hogging occurs when the center is supported by the land, or a cresting wave. but the ends are unsupported. This causes the hull to arch or curve upwards like a pig's back.
And during a launch, which stress dominates?
Hogging dominates. When you're launching bow first, the bow floats free first. As the rest of the ship continues to slide, a massive amount of weight is concentrated on the short segment of the hull still in the landways, while the front is being lifted by the water.
And that creates maximum bending strain on the hull.
Maximum hogging, yeah. It could cause irreparable structural damage, or, as the 18th century engineer Pierre Bouget noted, the separation of planking where it was joined.
So shifting to stern first launching was a direct response to the stress concentration. How did stern entry reduce the hogging?
When you launch stern first, the stern, which is generally wider, heavier, and less buoyant than the bow, sinks gradually into the water. This gradual, heavy entry prevents the bow from lifting violently and dramatically as the ship floats free.
So it distributes the weight transition more smoothly.
It does. It prevents that sharp, unsupported moment where the hull arches, and by doing so, launching stern first dramatically reduced the risk of catastrophic hogging on the keel and the rest of the hull structure. Bouget, in his landmark 1746 text, meticulously studied these strains.
What did he find?
He noted that if the launchways were too short and didn't extend far enough into the water, the hull could arch considerably. He described the telltale sign of excessive hogging as the separation of the higher planks where they were previously joined, providing an infallible mark that a ship is bent or arched.
It's incredible that the entire engineering evolution of naval architecture was often driven by that single, brief, terrifying moment of the launch itself. It's the ultimate test of the shipwright's calculation.
The challenge of moving immense weight is universal. Remember that anecdote from Robinson Crusoe? After he built his massive canoe, he admitted the launch was a difficulty much harder to surmount than all the consequences of want of tools.
Right. He realized it would take him 10 or 12 years to dig a canal to bring the water up to his boat, and it would be easier to sail the boat 45 miles than move it 100 yards across dry land. That simple realization just underscores the sheer physical effort and calculation that went into every launch for millennia. This deep dive has spanned over 3,000 years. From the Bronze Age geometry etched into the timbers of the Philip VI to the modern legal battles raging over the San Jose. We started by questioning our assumptions about technological progress, moving from the inherently rigid shell-first system to the more manufacturable, frame-based architecture.
And that structural analysis provides a powerful lesson. The shift wasn't toward strength maximization, but toward optimization for efficiency, flexibility, and speed of construction. It was a powerful economic and social transformation disguised as a mechanical one. The rigidity of the frame-based construction became dependent on just adding more materials, rather than relying on the intrinsic strength of the joinery itself.
We've uncovered world history through the cargoes. The Bronze Age globalization captured in Nefertiti's gold scarab and 10 tons of copper from Uluburun, the persistent Iron Age trade revealed at Dor, and the mass production economy of Song Dynasty China reflected in the standardized porcelain of Huaguanzhou I.
And we've grappled with the crucial moral and legal lessons of the modern era. The necessity of perpetual
If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost sense the descent. Imagine drifting deeper, past the sun's reach, into a realm where time truly stands still. Here, beneath the tranquil surface, ancient shipwrecks whisper tales of long-lost voyages and forgotten civilizations.
It's an invitation, really.
It is. Join us for a serene journey to these silent sentinels, a perfect escape to unwind and discover the hidden beauty and, well, the untold knowledge of the deep.
That ethereal imagery sets the perfect stage for our deep dive today. We aren't rushing for simple headlines or, quick treasure.
No, not at all.
We are engaged in the patient, meticulous uncovering of secrets. What can these vessels tell us, not just about tragedy, but about ingenuity, commerce, and the sheer effort of ancient life?
Exactly. Our source material for this is incredibly rich. It spans archaeological reports, conservation science, and even complex international law.
So we've organized this immersion into 3 major themes, just to give you a roadmap of where we're headed.
We have. First, we're going to unpack the astonishing, often deeply personal artifacts that survived the centuries.
Things that connect us directly to the people on board. I've read about silk dresses, even still viable yeast.
That's right. Then second, we'll sink into the deep science of ancient ship construction. We'll be comparing some really counterintuitive findings that have come out of modern structural analysis.
And flank.
And finally, we will explore the fragile nature of this heritage. We'll look at the conservation challenges required to stabilize these precious finds and the complex, multi-party legal battles that define their ownership and future preservation.
So let's begin our descent and explore that initial lure, the legendary discoveries and the intimate artifacts that draw us into the depths.
The profound silence that defines a wreck site is often broken by the unexpected voice of an artifact.
And these discoveries, they offer an immediate, intimate connection to the people who sailed these long-lost vessels.
They really do.
When most of us think of artifacts from catastrophic wrecks, we often go immediately to the grand scale. But it's the personal items that truly resonate. The Titanic, for example.
Of course, a tragedy of epic proportions.
Yet the specific story of Wallace Hartley's violin, that just speaks to the human resolve in those final moments.
It's such a haunting piece of maritime history. Hartley, the band leader, famously played on with his musicians as the great ship sank in 1912.
And the detail that the source material notes is so powerful that he secured his violin in its leather case and tied it tightly around his chest before he went into the freezing North Atlantic waters.
It's an incredible image, and although that protective measure, sadly, it failed to save him from the cold, the violin case and its contents were later recovered alongside his body.
And the instrument was ultimately returned to his distraught fiancée.
It was. And that violin, it's now an icon of human fortitude. It's housed in the Titanic Museum in Tennessee, a palpable, quiet reminder of the culture and courage lost on that lavish but doomed voyage.
But we don't only find these poignant personal links in recent history.
No, not at all. Moving back centuries, sometimes the most surprising finds are items that just defy the destructive power of salt water over time.
You're thinking of the 17th century Palmwood wreck, right? The one located in the cold, silty waters off Texel in the Netherlands.
Exactly. The ship was named after the exotic palmwood chests found aboard, but what the wreck yielded was something far more fragile.
An entire silk dress and a velvet purse, both miraculously preserved.
For organic material like silk to survive centuries in the ocean it's highly unusual. The dress was an exquisite example of 17th century fashion.
And the quality of it, the expense of the silk and velvet, the tailoring, it all suggests the owner was a woman of exceptional wealth.
And high social status, possibly even a member of European royalty. It elevates the wreck site from a statistic into a deeply personal narrative about a single important life.
The deep ocean is generally hostile to organic material. We know this. Yet in certain cold, dark, anaerobic environments, it acts as a phenomenal natural time capsule.
It really does, allowing for incredible cases of preservation and revealing some ancient technological ingenuity.
Fantastic. And I have to say, a rather delicious example comes from the merchant vessel Sydney Cove.
Ah, yes, which sank off Tasmania in 1797. The sources detail how the water temperature there was a perfect preserving cold.
So when archaeologists recovered sealed glass bottles in the 1990s, they found a scientific treasure inside.
They discovered still viable yeast. Not only had the yeast survived for over 2 centuries, but it was identified as a rare strain.
Saccharomyces cerevisiae, I believe?
That's the one. No longer commonly used by modern brewers. So this presented a unique opportunity for scientific experimentation.
So they were actually able to cultivate it, to bring it back.
That's right. Scientists were able to cultivate and propagate this rare yeast, allowing them to brew a new batch of beer using the ancient organism.
That's incredible. It gave them an incredibly tangible experience, a taste of what the sailors on the Sydney Cove would have actually consumed.
It's a biological link to the 18th century, preserved in glass.
And speaking of ingenuity, these wrecks frequently showcase how ancient mariners solved fundamental logistical challenges.
Absolutely. Take the French Navy corvette La Seine, which met its end off New Caledonia in 1846.
And from that wreck, they salvaged its copper kitchen stove. But attached to it was this beautifully crafted water distiller.
Which was a critical piece of technology for long-distance naval travel.
Can you explain how this distiller worked? Because for early ships, freshwater storage was one of the biggest limiting factors for global exploration.
It really was. And this distiller was a groundbreaking piece of design. It harnessed the existing heat produced by the ship's stove, which was already required for cooking and heating, to boil salt water.
And the steam was then captured and condensed.
Exactly. It was captured, condensed, and purified, yielding fresh, drinkable water. This dramatically increased the operational range of the vessel and reduced its reliance on frequent port calls for resupply.
So it was a major leap in naval logistics for the mid-19th century.
A huge leap.
And if we journey all the way back to the Byzantine era, we find similar practical ingenuity, but this time in the realm of communication. We have to talk about the Byzantine notepad.
The one found during the enormous Yenikapı excavations in Istanbul.
Yes.
Among the dozens of Byzantine-era ships uncovered there, the Yenikapı ship 12, which dates to the 8th century, yielded a find that felt strangely anachronistic.
Archaeologists recovered 5 fitted wooden tablets.
And these tablets were hinged together like a book. They featured recessed areas filled with a layer of colored wax.
So the owner would use a stylus to etch notes directly onto the wax surface. It was basically a reusable, erasable notebook.
An ancient, portable piece of office equipment. And what's fascinating is the sophistication of its simplicity. The tablets often had small storage compartments for the styluses or maybe spare wax.
It just shows us that even in the chaotic environment of maritime trade in the 8th century, there was a need for immediate temporary record keeping.
And this notebook served that purpose perfectly.
Beyond these intimate details, entire wrecks can serve as definitive historical markers. Sometimes they solve centuries-old mysteries simply through their distinct features or surviving weaponry.
The definitive identification of HMS Victory is a perfect case in point. This British Royal Navy second-rate ship was lost in a massive storm in 1744 with over 1,100 crew members.
And its location remained one of the sea's great puzzles until, 2008?
That's right. And the sources detail that while the entire site provided context, the positive identification of the wreck was ultimately secured by one specific artifact.
A large 42-pound bronze cannon.
Exactly. That cannon, recovered during the search, was embossed with the distinct crest of King George I. This inscription provided irrefutable proof of the ship's identity, linking the wreckage directly to the famed Royal Navy vessel.
So it ended a 264-year mystery and allowed for the appropriate memorialization and management of the site.
It did. But sometimes the artifact provides the mystery itself, rather than solving one.
Right, and this brings us to the complexities of ownership and provenance, which is perfectly exemplified by that stunning bronze statue, the Victorious Youth.
Discovered in 1964 by an Italian fishing trawler, this magnificent 4th century BC bronze likely originated from an ancient Greek vessel that sank while transporting precious cargo.
Its quality suggests it may have been plundered from a major Greek sanctuary, perhaps Delphi or Olympia.
It's a masterpiece, currently housed in the Getty Museum in California. But because the exact wreck site and its circumstances remain largely unknown, the provenance is intensely debated.
And it highlights how a singular ancient masterpiece, simply because it was recovered from the deep, can become entangled in modern, international, legal, and ethical battles over ownership.
A theme that brings us neatly toward our economic analysis.
When we look at cargo, particularly cargo from millennia past, we're doing more than just cataloging objects. We're really reading the physical ledger of a forgotten economy.
You're transforming shipwrecks into crucial economic data points and cultural timelines.
Let's focus on the Mediterranean Iron Age for a moment, a period of immense political and economic flux. Recent discoveries in the Dor Lagoon on Israel's Carmel coast have provided a remarkable insight into this period.
This area was once the bustling port city of Dor, and researchers found a trio of submerged cargo clusters dating from the 11th to 6th centuries BCE.
And why is this specific find considered so immensely significant?
Well, it's the direct connection to the port. These clusters represent the first Iron Age ship cargoes tied unequivocally to a known ancient port city in the southern Levant. They provide a continuous maritime record spanning 500 years.
And that's a period traversing the shifts between Egyptian, Phoenician, Assyrian, and Babylonian domination.
Exactly. A huge amount of change.
So let's unpack the specifics of the cargo. What commodities were they actually trading, and what does that tell us about the supply chain?
Well, the site Dor L2, dating to the late 7th or early 6th century BCE, provided crucial physical proof of industry. It contained iron ingots, the material that defined the age.
So the movement of raw metals.
Right. And more interesting, perhaps, were the bases of basket handle amphorae, these tall jars used for shipping liquid goods.
And what did those jars contain?
The analysis revealed residues of resin and grape seeds. This confirms the movement of critical trade goods like wine, oil, or resin used for waterproofing or perhaps flavoring.
So these finds are physical evidence of the commodities flowing through this critical crossroads of empires.
They are, and the analysis of the different clusters helps historians chart changes in trade partners over time.
Right. I think the data from Dora 1 was particularly telling.
It was. Dating earlier, late 9th to early 8th century BCE, it contained distinctly Phoenician-style jars and fine, thin-walled bowls. Yet researchers noted a remarkable absence of trade evidence with major regional partners like Egypt and Cyprus during that period.
And that structural absence, it aligns with the historical evidence that suggested a decline in Dor's external connectivity when it was under Israelite control.
It does. But the overarching finding is that despite these major political upheavals over half a millennium, the shipwrecks provide unequivocal evidence for the continuation of maritime activity.
So the takeaway is that sea trade, often run by private merchants, proved to be a fundamental constant force.
It bound distant coastlines and sustained regional economies, even when armies were marching across the land.
Now, moving back even further in time, we arrive at what is arguably the most complex and famous ancient discovery in the Mediterranean.
The Uluburun shipwreck.
Off the coast of Turkey, dating to the late Bronze Age around 1320 BC. The technical challenges of this site alone define modern maritime archaeology.
Oh, the depth was punishing. The wreck lay between 44 and 61 meters deep, and the cargo wasn't neatly contained.
No, it was strewn over a vast area, I think 250 square meters down a steep, rocky slope.
That's right. So to recover this one single vessel's contents, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology had to conduct over 22,400 individual dives. It was a Herculean effort.
And the cargo itself, it reads like the master inventory list of the Bronze Age economy.
The most voluminous material was the raw metal required to fuel the period.
The core of the find.
It was 10 tons of oxide copper ingots shaped uniquely for transport, along with about a ton of tin ingots, the critical partner metal for bronze production.
That volume alone speaks volumes about the level of industry required at the time.
It does. I also recall the source mentioning the specialized conservation challenge presented by those copper ingots. They were heavily degraded after 3 millennia underwater.
They were, and this demonstrates the intersection of archaeology and chemistry. The ingots were so structurally compromised that they were effectively collapsing when touched.
So archaeologists had to pioneer a technique.
They did, injecting the synthetic acrylic polymer, Perloid B72, dissolved in acetone, directly into the massive copper forms underwater.
Wow, underwater.
To chemically stabilize their structural integrity before they could be carefully brought to the surface for further treatment.
That effort literally saved the components of the Bronze Age economy. But the Uluburun wasn't just carrying raw material.
No, it was carrying the highest value luxury goods of the era.
Indeed. We are talking about 24 logs of African ebony, elephant, and hippopotamus ivory, 3 fragile ostrich eggshell vases.
And perhaps the most geographically significant piece, a gold scarab inscribed with the name of Nefertiti.
Proving direct links to the Egyptian royal court. It's astonishing.
And the glass ingots are an important story in their own right. They reveal ancient methods of imitating prestige items.
The ship carried an astonishing 350 kilos of glass disc ingots, amounting to over 175 individual pieces.
And this glass came in vibrant shades of dark blue, turquoise, purple, and yellow.
Crucially, this glass was manufactured specifically to imitate more naturally precious and rare materials, like lapis lazuli, amethyst, and amber.
Which would then be used for intricate jewelry and inlay work across the region.
Right, and what these items collectively suggest about the voyage's purpose is that they point strongly to high-level state trade.
Likely diplomatic gift exchanges between major rulers in Egypt, Western Asia, and the Aegean.
Exactly. The items closely resemble inventories detailed in diplomatic correspondence from that time, suggesting this was a royal or official mission, not just a standard merchant run.
And finally, the sources give us a rare glimpse into the identity of the people aboard. It suggests a multicultural composition that reflects the complexity of the Bronze Age sea routes.
The evidence suggests the ship hosted travelers from multiple cultures. The discovery of 4 distinct pan balances and their corresponding weights indicates the presence of at least 4 Phoenicians or Canaanite merchants.
Likely handling the commercial side of the goods.
Almost certainly. And then there are the items associated with the Aegean.
The Mycenaean seals and unique double axes.
Those, alongside pairs of specific personal effects, strongly suggest that at least 2 Mycenaeans were also traveling on the ship.
So these high-value multi-regional items confirmed that the ship was a true meeting point.
A microcosm of a thriving, complex, and highly integrated international sea network.
While the Mediterranean was defining the Bronze Age, centuries later, the Far East developed its own vast, world-shaping ocean network, the Maritime Silk Road.
And recent discoveries in the South China Sea, including 500-year-old Ming Dynasty shipwrecks, testify to the sheer scale of that trade.
The most profound insight into this trade, though, comes from the Song Dynasty wreck, Guangzhou 1.
Right, which sank near the Shisha Islands around 1162 AD. The study of its cargo fundamentally changed the perception of the Silk Road as purely a conduit for the elite.
Can you explain that contrast? What did the Guangzhou 1 reveal about the consumer market?
Well, the cargo consisted of enormous, standardized quantities of porcelain. We're talking about blue and white celadon and brown glazed porcelain bowls, plates, and jars.
So this wasn't unique, high art pottery. This was mass-produced, inexpensive, yet well-made cargo.
Precisely. It indicates a market dominated by mass consumption, not just luxury.
It shows that by the 12th century, the global overseas market demanded standardization and volume.
And the Chinese ceramics industry was operating on an industrial scale, supplying goods not just to ruling classes, but to a wider global population.
Fundamentally expanding the economic reach of the Far East. The Guangzhou 1 also reveals critical details about Chinese naval engineering.
Specifically, the design elements of the Fujian junk style that made these long-distance journeys possible.
The structure itself is fascinating. The ship was constructed primarily using 80% pine wood.
And to ensure durability in the open ocean, the builders employed a robust system featuring 5 to 6 layers of planking, all fastened together with iron nails and sealed against water intrusion with pine resin.
But their signature innovation, the one that truly set them apart from their contemporaries.
That would be the revolutionary system of watertight bulkhead compartments. This Fujian junk featured 10 distinct separated compartments.
So if the hull was breached, only the flooded section would take on water,
Massively increasing the ship's survivability and ability to resist sinking. This was a foundational piece of naval technology that predated similar concepts used in Western shipbuilding by many centuries.
It's a tragic irony that, as detailed in the sources, the site of the Guangzhou 1 itself became a victim of human activity.
It suffered irreversible damage, which leads us into our next segment.
Having looked at the cargo and the trade, we now shift to the very bones of the vessels, the engineering genius that allowed these sprawling networks to function.
And we're going to focus on a critical, slow technological transition that defined global shipbuilding for centuries.
We're talking about the shift in methodology that took place in the Mediterranean around the first millennium AD. The move from building the skin first to building the internal skeleton first.
Let's clearly define these two foundational methods prevalent between the 5th century BC and the 6th century AD. The older method is shell-first construction.
In the shell-first approach, the integrity of the hull rested primarily on the planks themselves, right?
Exactly. The long strakes of wood were meticulously fitted together using complex joinery edge joined, using thousands of pegged or unpegged mortise and tenon joints, dowels, or cokes.
This complex joinery created an incredibly rigid, monolithic hull first.
And the transverse frames, the ribs, were then inserted later simply to reinforce this already rigid planking and hold the interior shape. The classic example is the Mogan Michael ship from 400 BC.
And the newer method was the frame-based technique. This approach reversed the priority.
Yes, in frame-based construction, the builders started by fixing the transverse frames, the ribs that form the skeleton, directly to the keel.
And the planks were then fastened, usually with iron nails, onto this pre-existing skeleton.
So the structure relies on the strength of the internal framework. The Door 2011 shipwreck, dating to the 6th century AD, is a prime example of this later skeletal technique.
The big historical question is, why did the world abandon the meticulous, joinery-heavy, shell-first method for the frame-based method? Was the new way simply stronger?
To answer that, historians turned to advanced engineering. They employed something called finite element analysis, or FEA.
This is a powerful numerical reconstruction tool, the kind of thing used today to model and stress test highly complex structures like aircraft or oil tankers.
That's right, by using CAD modeling to create exact digital representations of archetypal ancient ships, like the shell-first Mogan Michael and the frame-based Door 2011, researchers could apply various simulated loads.
Things like wind stress, wave impact, cargo weight, and forces like hogging and sagging.
The goal was to measure their structural integrity under standardized conditions. Initially, both structures appeared robust, showing high rigidity and low stress values under normal loading.
However, the controlled comparative analyses revealed a startling result, one that really challenges our assumptions about technological evolution.
This is where it gets truly counterintuitive. Under identical and controlled load scenarios, the older shell-first samples consistently exhibited significantly higher structural integrity and greater inherent rigidity.
Compared to the early frame-based samples.
That's right. It means that the older method, with its thousands of precise joints creating a thick, stiff shell, was mechanically superior in its basic form.
The natural conclusion would be that the world should have stuck with shell-first construction.
You would think. But history clearly shows a decisive shift to the frame-based model. So if the shell-first method was inherently stronger, how did the frame-based system gain traction and initially dominate?
The FEA studies provided the mechanical answer: compensation.
They demonstrated that the frame-based technique's strength and rigidity were directly dependent on mechanical necessities being added after the initial design.
And what specifically was needed?
It required adding a far greater number of transverse frames, making the hull heavier and more complex internally. Furthermore, secondary studies showed the necessity of incorporating longitudinal reinforcements
Stringers running the length of the ship.
in specific configurations. The frame-based system only achieved equivalence to its predecessor when these heavy compensations were introduced.
So mechanically, the frame-based method was initially a step backward in inherent rigidity. It required substantial corrective measures to function effectively.
Which suggests that the ultimate success of the frame-based method wasn't driven by strength, but must have been driven by other non-mechanical factors, a point we will certainly return to.
Beyond the material and structural bones, we have to look at the intellectual blueprint. How did ancient builders design these complex hull shapes without the detailed, scaled architectural drawings we use today?
They relied on sophisticated non-graphic design methods, and the primary one we see evidence for in the Mediterranean is hull molding.
Hull molding focuses on defining the central, fullest part of the hull, using a single, physical master mold.
That's right. This mold defined the shape of the midship bend, the largest cross-section of the vessel. In French, this was known as the maître gabarit, or in certain Greek traditions, the manna.
The complexity comes in how they translated that one master shape across the entire hull, narrowing and adjusting the curve toward the bow and stern, while ensuring the lines remained harmonious and fair.
This required a specialized three-piece toolkit. First, they used the rising square, known in French as the tablette d'accournant. This tool was critical for adjusting the height of the floor timbers, ensuring the bottom of the hull rose correctly from the keel.
And the second key tool.
That was the trebuchet. This was a special wooden scale used specifically for correcting the width. It helped the builder control the rate at which the break line narrowed toward the bow and stern,
ensuring a symmetrical and hydrodynamic curve.
Exactly. So using the master mold, the rising square for height, and the trebuchet for width correction, the builder could extrapolate the shape of all the other frames from a single starting point, guaranteeing a visually and functionally fair hull.
And this wasn't just theoretical.
No. The Culeps 6 wreck, dating to the 13th to 14th century, provides the oldest archaeological proof of this specific methodology. The surviving floor timbers clearly show engraved surmarks that align precisely with the geometric organization of the hull molding design process.
So this tradition persisted for centuries.
It did. It's traceable through Venetian manuscripts and lasted into the 18th century Greek monokneuro method, which literally translates to one single mold.
The process of building, sailing, and sinking takes place over decades, but the preservation of that history is an immediate, high-stakes scientific challenge.
Our final dive focuses on the immense perpetual effort required to transition this fragile heritage from the deep to the museum.
The management of underwater cultural heritage, or UCH, is defined by extreme fragility. The moment artifacts are brought to the surface, exposed to air, fluctuating temperatures, and light.
Their centuries of stable rest are violently disrupted.
Let's start with one of the most persistent threats to non-organic finds: salt saturation.
Yes. Objects recovered from saltwater environments are completely permeated with salt crystals. And if that salt isn't removed, the consequences are disastrous.
As the object begins to dry, The dissolved salt crystallizes within the pores of the material.
And this expanding crystallization applies immense physical pressure, rapidly fracturing and destroying the artifact from the inside out.
So the painstaking process of desalination, often involving years of soaking the object in gradually decreasing salinity baths, is slow, costly, and absolutely non-negotiable.
It is. Then there is the phenomenon known as concretion, which seems like both a preservation aid and a monumental challenge for archaeologists.
It is a remarkable chemical process. Concretion occurs when iron artifacts corrode, and the corrosion product mixes with surrounding sand, sediment, and sea life.
Forming a hard, rocky shell around the metal. Underwater, this shell often provides a perfect anaerobic seal, protecting the metal and sometimes other artifacts trapped within.
But the removal process, once they reach the lab, must be incredibly intense.
It requires extreme care. Removing the concretion involves meticulous air scribing, grinding, and specialized chemical baths to reveal the artifact within. It can take years of work.
And sometimes, the only evidence that an iron artifact was there is the hollow, sheet-retaining void left inside the concretion shell.
Precisely. The challenges are even more acute for organic materials like waterlogged wood, leather, or textiles, which comprise many of the stunning finds we discussed earlier.
These materials must remain constantly wet from the moment of extraction.
Yes. If waterlogged wood, for example, is allowed to dry too quickly, the physics of surface tension take over.
The water that filled the cellular structure evaporates, and the powerful tension pulls the weakened cell walls inward,
leading to catastrophic shrinkage, distortion, and the object literally crumbling in a matter of hours or days.
So the famous conservation efforts, like those for the Vasa or the Mary Rose, involve decades of treating the wood with stabilizing agents like polyethylene glycol. It's a massive investment.
It is. Continuous water-filled care and specialized chemical treatments are essential to replace the water within the cell structure with a solid, stabilizing polymer,
permanently altering the object to allow it to withstand atmospheric conditions.
Sadly, time and chemistry are not the only dangers. Modern human activity and accelerating environmental changes pose significant immediate risks to these sites worldwide.
The sources highlight climate change as a major destructive force.
Specifically, the increased frequency and intensity of supercharged tropical storms. These powerful weather events generate massive waves and currents that can easily scour the seabed,
obliterating fragile shipwreck sites, resting in shallow waters. Critical historical data can simply vanish in a single hurricane.
And we also face the very real, but often overlooked, environmental risk posed by modern sunken vessels.
What the sources term potentially polluting wrecks, or PPWs.
This is a serious issue for marine health and heritage. PPWs are modern wrecks, generally sunk since 1890, that may still contain substantial quantities of oil or other hazardous cargo.
And a major survey in 2005 estimated that over 8,500 submerged wrecks globally may still contain oil,
contributing significantly to long-term marine pollution and degrading the environment that protects older cultural heritage sites.
And then there is the direct threat of illegal human intervention, which sadly often results in the most immediate and devastating losses of historical context.
Looting and illegal salvaging remain rampant, especially at high-value sites. We mentioned the Huaguanzhou one earlier. That site, rich with Song Dynasty ceramics, suffered irreversible damage.
The extent of the violence used by these illegal salvagers is shocking. The reports confirmed that bulkheads were violently pried open, planking was torn away.
And there was clear evidence that explosives had been deployed by the looters to force entry into cargo holds. This disregard for the historical context and the physical site represents a devastating loss that cannot be recovered.
Given the fragility, the historical significance, and the commercial value of these sites, the ownership and management of UCH becomes a legal labyrinth,
pitting countries, researchers, and commercial salvers against one another.
In the United States, site management is guided by the Abandoned Shipwreck Act, or ASA, guidelines. These try to balance competing interests,
providing sport divers with reasonable access, supporting rigorous archaeological research, and limiting commercial recovery to specific circumstances.
A key element of the ASA framework, Guideline 8, speaks directly to the economic reality of preservation. It formally discourages the recovery and display of intact shipwrecks,
unless they are in immediate danger of unavoidable destruction, and, crucially, unless sufficient, sustained public or private funds are already secured.
Why the strong discouragement against full recovery?
Because the costs to properly raise, stabilize, conserve, maintain, and perpetually exhibit an intact shipwreck are described in the sources as prohibitively expensive and perpetual.
So for most wrecks, keeping them in situ, protected on the seabed, is the preferred and fiscally responsible preservation strategy.
It is. The ultimate legal complication, especially in international waters or over historically important vessels, often revolves around sovereign immunity.
This doctrine shields warships or government vessels used for non-commercial purposes from legal proceedings by other states.
We saw this principle tested dramatically with the Spanish frigate Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes, sunk in 1804.
When the American commercial exploration company, Odyssey Marine Exploration, recovered nearly 1 million gold and silver coins and artifacts in 2007, Spain immediately asserted sovereign immunity.
Claiming the vessel was a government warship. And after years of legal wrangling in U.S. courts, the U.S. federal court upheld Spain's claim in 2012.
Forcing the American company to return the entire massive haul to the Spanish government.
It demonstrated the overwhelming power of sovereign immunity over commercial salvage rights when applied to military vessels.
A similar, but far more complex, multi-party legal battle involves the San Jose galleon.
Right, which sank off the coast of Cartagena, Colombia in 1708. Upon its discovery in 2015, its estimated net worth was valued at over $20 billion.
Because of its cargo of gold, silver, and jewels, this high valuation has created an international tangle.
The dispute involves not only Colombia, in whose waters the wreck was found, and Spain, which registered and owned the ship, but also the indigenous Carajara nation.
The Carajara assert a claim because their ancestral lands in Bolivia were the origin of the vast riches carried aboard the San Jose.
And compounding this, an American salvage company that claimed to have found the wreck decades earlier is also involved in the dispute. This continuing legal and cultural entanglement shows just how multi-layered and historically sensitive the stakes become.
When immense commercial value, national heritage, and indigenous rights all collide in the deep.
Precisely.
Our tranquil journey through the deep now draws to a close, and we begin our slow ascent, leaving the silent sentinels to their rest.
We have transitioned from the intimate tragedy of the Titanic violin and the preservation miracle of the Sydney Cove yeast to the industrial scale of the Bronze Age trade revealed by the Uluburun.
We sailed the ancient commercial routes of the Iron Age door, seeing how persistent trade networks bypassed shifting political powers and explored the groundbreaking stability offered by the watertight bulkheads of the Far East's Fujian junks.
And perhaps most tellingly, we deciphered the complex geometry and structural paradoxes scribed by ancient naval architects.
Noting the counterintuitive finding that the older, meticulous shell-first method was often mechanically superior in inherent strength compared to the early frame-based designs.
That structural comparison is perhaps the most enduring puzzle for nautical historians. The evidence clearly shows that the new frame-based method required significant compensation. More frames, heavy longitudinal reinforcements, just to achieve the equivalent strength of its predecessor.
Yet, the world transitioned decisively away from the highly rigid shell-first technique.
And the sources noted that for a full understanding of this colossal technological shift, further research is desperately needed into the ancillary economic, social, and ecological issues intertwined with engineering factors.
So, we leave you with this provocative thought to ponder as you resurface.
If the shift wasn't primarily driven by superior strength, what non-mechanical pressures, perhaps related to the sheer cost of the highly skilled labor required for thousands of mortise and tenon joints, or the availability of the massive, naturally curved timbers needed for a shell-first approach, or simply the need for faster, more industrialized construction methods, do you think were the true driving force that caused seemingly technically superior methods to be abandoned?
The deep holds its secrets quietly, but by seeking them out, we gain a profound and rich understanding of the entire human story. Sure. But our mission really is to look at the crucial pivot points in naval history. We have to start with this massive kind of counterintuitive shift in how ships were even built.
And from there, we'll unpack what the remnants tell us about ancient economics. And this is the big one, how modern law struggles to even define who owns the past.
Okay, let's unpack this structural transition first, because it's a real mind bender.
Absolutely. We're looking at this profound, really slow shift that happened around the first millennium AD. It's the transition from the older shell-first technique to the newer frame-based method.
And these are just radically different philosophies of construction.
Absolutely.
So the shell first method, this is the ancient technique, and it was refined over centuries. The best example we have is the McGaugan-Michael ship, which dates all the way back to 400 BC.
400 BC.
Yeah, and just imagine building a boat, like a massive wooden eggshell. The builder would first construct the exterior hull of the shell by joining these long planks, the strakes, edge to edge.
So the strakes are the skin, and they're joined together like puzzle pieces before the skeleton even exists.
Precisely. Yeah, before any of that, they use these incredibly meticulous and complex joinery methods, things like peg, mortise, and tenons, sometimes even dowels, or literally sewing the planks together.
Sewing them. That sounds like a massive investment in time.
Right?
And just incredibly precise carpentry.
It was. The mortise and tenon joint, for anyone who's not a woodworker, is basically this super precise lock and key that's carved right into the wood. The end of one plank fits perfectly into a hole in the next.
Okay, so you get this really strong, self-supporting hull from the very start.
Exactly. And the transverse frames, what we would think of as the ship's ribs, they were only fitted after the shell was totally complete. They were just supports, really, independent of the main structure.
And then we see the big change. Around the time of the 2011 ship, so 6th century AD, we get the frame-based method, the skeleton-first approach.
Correct. The logic just flipped entirely. Now, the first step was fixing the ribs, the frames, to the keel to form a complete skeleton.
And only then do you nail the planks onto the outside of that skeleton.
Right. And it's a much faster process, requires less precise geometry up front because the frame is what dictates the shape, not the planking itself.
Okay, now here's where the analysis you shared throws us the biggest structural curveball. Because you would naturally assume the frame-based method won out because it was, stronger, better.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But that's not what the modern analysis showed. And this is why we use tools like finite element analysis, FEA.
Right, this is the modern computer modeling.
Yeah, for those who don't know, FEA is this powerful technique engineers use to predict how a structure, a bridge, plane wing, or, an ancient wooden boat will react to real-world stress.
So you can basically put a 400 BC ship into a virtual storm.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
So researchers modeled both the Mogan-Michael, the shell first ship, and the Door 2011, the frame-based one. And the initial comparison, just under standard still water conditions, showed both ships were, quote, on a structural par, high rigidity, low stress.
So the new method wasn't a game changer based on basic performance.
Not at first glance, but then, and this is a key part, they ran experiments on generic models to really isolate the construction method itself, and the verdict just flipped decisively.
Oh, wow.
The ancient shell-first samples, they consistently and significantly showed higher rigidity and less stress. The shell-first method was just fundamentally a stronger structure.
Wait. The ancient, more meticulous method was actually structurally better.
Yes.
That is a massive insight. So if the shift wasn't driven by better engineering, what was it?
This is where it gets really interesting. The data shows the strength of that later frame-based ship depended directly on just adding more frames, more internal supports.
So you're just adding more wood to make up for the weaker design.
It implies a trade-off, yeah.
Yeah.
Why would builders choose a less rigid method that needed more timber? And the consensus points to, well, ancillary factors.
Economics. Yeah.
The ability to build a ship way faster with less specialized, less expensive labor, or maybe even ecological factors like a dwindling supply of the huge high-quality timber you needed for those perfect shell-first planks.
So a major technological shift that wasn't about better physics, it was about better, faster economics, or just resource scarcity.
Precisely.
Right.
Which leads us right into the next problem.
Yeah.
So now you're using a frame-first approach. How do you actually create those complex curved hull shapes consistently without modern tools?
Right, you need a template, but how do you get a three-dimensional curve from flat templates?
Well, they used this really clever non-graphical technique called hole molding. It was a simple system based on three main instruments, starting with the master mold, or the maître gabarit in French.
The master mold. Sounds like the most critical piece.
It was. This was the template that defined the shape of the midship section, the widest, deepest point of the boat. Think of it like a giant wooden stencil for the perfect cross-section.
And the brilliance of the system was that every other frame was somehow derived from that one template.
Exactly. To shape the frames going toward the bow and stern, they didn't carve new shapes. They just applied standardized adjustments to that master mold. They had narrowing corrections to reduce the breadth, and rising corrections for vertical adjustment.
That is such an elegant system. You only had to perfect one template, and then you just had rules to apply it everywhere else. Do we have hard evidence for this?
We do. The Shipwrecks, which dates to the late 13th, early 14th century, is the oldest archaeological evidence we have of this specific system. And this Mediterranean technique was so effective it just spread. It influenced Atlantic shipbuilding, it shows up in Portuguese accounts in the 17th century, and later in French and English naval architecture.
It really connects the medieval Mediterranean to the Great Age of Sail. Okay, let's leave the ship structure behind and focus on why we even look for these wrecks. The priceless history locked in their cargo. These things are global time capsules.
Oh, they absolutely redefine trade history. Take the Door Lagoon Iron Age cargoes from the 11th to 6th centuries BCE. Iron Age wrecks are incredibly rare, and these are the first cargoes we can link directly to the ancient port city of Dor.
And what did they actually find?
The finds included these typical Phoenician-style jars and critically raw iron ingots, which was the high-value commodity of the age, right?
The basis of the new technology.
Exactly. They also found basket handle amphorae that still had traces of resin and even grape seeds inside. This is just, it's unequivocal evidence for constant, robust maritime activity linking places like Egypt, Phoenicia, and Cyprus. It proves that sea trade just kept on going, even when empires on land were rising and falling.
So if the Dor cargo proves persistence, then the Bronze Age Uluburun shipwreck shows sheer, breathtaking globalization. That wreck, off Turkey from around 1350 BC, the scale is just staggering.
Staggering is an understatement. Think about the logistics. The Uluburun wreck gave us 17 tons of artifacts. The raw materials alone included 10 tons of copper ingots.
10 tons?
10 tons. And a lot of them were shaped like ox hides, which was a standard currency back then. And there was tin, too, which you needed to make bronze.
So you've got the raw materials for an entire Bronze Age foundry on one ship.
You do. But it wasn't just metal. They found 350 kilos of raw glass ingots in 4 different colors: dark blue, turquoise, purple, and yellow. These were meant to be crafted into luxury goods to imitate things like lapis lazuli.
And speaking of that, the ship also had actual Baltic amber, plus elephant and hippopotamus ivory. That cargo list reads like a royal gift registry.
It does. The items came from over 7 different regions: Syria, Egypt, mainland Greece. It connects the entire known world of the late Bronze Age. Some personal effects like seals and weapons even suggest the crew might have included Mycenaean officials. This was probably a state-level mission.
You know, it's fascinating that the stories aren't just told by precious metals. The survival of organic matter is what really gets me.
It's incredible. The Marsala ship from 200 BC, the oldest warship wreck we have, it showed the crew ate fresh fish and meat, not just salted rations. And get this, each crew member had their own individualized drinking cup. Surprisingly personal detail.
And what about that French corvette, the La Seine? The stove on that one tells its own story.
Yes. Sunk in 1846, it had a copper kitchen stove with a built-in water distiller. It was designed to use the stove's heat to make saltwater drinkable. That one piece of tech dramatically expanded how long and how far you could travel.
And then you get these moments of pure time travel, like with the Sydney Cove.
Oh yeah, sank off Tasmania in 1797. The cold, dark water preserved sealed glass bottles of beer with still usable 18th century yeast strains. Its biological history, surviving for 200 years.
You contrast that with the human tragedy and massive wealth of modern wrecks. We all know about the Titanic, but recovering Wallace Hartley's violin, the musician who played as the ship went down, that gives the story such a tangible human link.
And that wealth can be astonishing. The SS Gersapa sunk in 1941 by a German U-boat. It was carrying 200 tons of silver bullion for the Royal Mint, value today at over 150 million pounds.
Wow. From Bronze Age copper to WWII silver, these wrecks are priceless. Which brings us to the moment of discovery and the huge challenges of preservation and ownership.
Right, let's start with preservation. The moment an artifact is brought into the light, you face a crisis.
Disintegration.
Rapid disintegration. Especially organic stuff like waterlogged wood. It has to stay submerged. The cell walls are super weak after centuries underwater, and if they dry out, the whole structure just collapses as the water evaporates.
That's why you see them in those big water tanks in museums.
Exactly. And the metals. They have their own problem. They often look like massive rocks when they're pulled up.
Yeah, you can't even tell what they are.
That's the problem of concretion. It's this hard shell that forms over centuries from corrosion, sand, and sea life. It completely encases the artifact. The copper ingots from the Uluburun, for example, were so fragile they had to inject them with an acrylic polymer, Paraloid B72, just to stabilize them enough to be handled.
Okay, so given the immense expense and difficulty, you can't just let anyone go down there. This is where something like the U.S. Abandoned Shipwreck Act comes in.
It does. The core purpose of the ASA is twofold: promoting public appreciation and archaeological research. In practice, that means any recovery, public or private, has to be deemed in the public interest.
So the state gets to decide.
The state decides. And crucially, while states can transfer the title of artifacts, anything unique, exceptionally valuable, or historically representative, that stuff should generally be retained by the state for the public. Now, if a wreck is deemed non-historic, like a modern barge or something, recovery is usually fine.
That seems like a solid framework for U.S. waters, but the second you move into international waters, the money gets so big it leads to these massive, bitter legal battles.
Absolutely. The classic example is the Spanish frigate Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes, sunk in 1804. A private salvage company found it and lifted 500,000 silver and gold coins.
500,000 coins?
But a U.S. court ruled entirely in favor of Spain, forced them to return the entire haul. The ruling was based on the international law of sovereign immunity. Because the ship was a government warship, its contents belonged to Spain, no matter where it was found.
That sets a strong precedent. If it's a government vessel, it belongs to the government. But what happens when you throw in billions of dollars in competing national interests?
Then you get the ongoing fight over the San Jose.
Oh, the Holy Grail.
Holy Grail, a Spanish galleon that sank off Colombia in 1708, carrying an estimated $20 billion worth of treasure. And this is not a simple salvage claim, it's a complete Gordian knot.
So who's fighting over it?
You've got the Colombian government, which found the wreck but is worried about Spain's claim of sovereign immunity, just like the Mercedes. Then you have the American salvage company, Sea Search Armada, which claims they located the wreck first.
And there's a third party to this $20 billion dispute, isn't there? One that complicates the whole meaning of ownership.
Yes, and this is the deep historical implication. The indigenous Croix Nation has entered the legal fight. They argue that the silver and gold were extracted from their ancestral lands under colonial rule.
So their claim goes back to the source of the wealth itself.
Exactly. It raises this profound question that salvage law often ignores.
Mm-hmm.
Who owns the resources used to create the historical wealth? Do they have a claim? It really just encapsulates this huge struggle over who truly owns history.
We've really journeyed from a microscopic analysis of a 400 BC plank joint to the highest courts grappling with indigenous claims over $20 billion in silver. That resilience of those old shelfer structures, it's a reminder of how brilliant those early naval architects really were.
It is. And the discoveries, from the Iron Age cargo proving constant trade to that astonishing list of goods on the Uluparan, it all underscores one singular truth. The seafloor holds the definitive, undeniable proof of our connected global past.
So what does this all mean for you? Consider this. The very complexity of the global legal battles over the San Jose or the Mercedes today, involving multiple nations, sovereign immunity, billions in value, is a direct modern echo of the high-stakes international commerce of royal gifts and massive raw material cargoes found on that Bronze Age Uluburan wreck 3 millennia ago. The technology has changed, the value has certainly inflated, but the immense risks and rewards of global high-stakes trade, they haven't changed at all.